Değerli misafirlerimiz, oturumumuz başlamak üzeredir. Lütfen yerlerinize. Tamamdır.
Değerli hocalarım, sevgili öğrenciler, sevgili katılımcılar, ilk panelimize hoş geldiniz. Bu panelde 4 konuşmacımız olacaktı fakat Pierre Sané gelemedi. 2 konuşmacımız videosunu izleyeceğiz konuşmalarının, 2 konuşmacımızın, bir konuşmacımızın da makalesini, bildirisini ben okuyacağım. Öncelikle ilk konuşmacımız Profesör Federico Mayor Zaragoza. Kendisinin gönderdiği şekliyle bilgi vermek istiyorum hakkında. İngilizce olacak bu, gönderdiği şekil. Professor Federico Mayor Zaragoza was born in Barcelona in 1934. He holds a PhD in pharmacy from the Universitat Complutense de Madrid. In 1963, he became a professor of biochemistry at the Facultad de Farmacia of the Universidad de Granada. In 1968, he became rector of the same institution, a job he held until 1972. The following year, he was named professor in his specialty at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. In these years, it started up the National Plan of Prevention of Mental Handicap to avoid, by means of precarious diagnosis, diseases that can evolve with serious mental deterioration. Among his other political responsibilities, Professor Mayor has been Undersecretary of Education and Science for the Spanish government, member of the Spanish Parliament, advisor to the Prime Minister, Minister of Education and Science, and member of the European Parliament. In 1978, he became Assistant Director General of the UNESCO. In 1987, he was elected Director General of the organization and was re-elected for a second time in 1993. In addition to his numerous scientific publications, Professor Federico Mayor has published 4 books of poetry and several books of essays. Videoyu başlatabilir miyiz lütfen?
My dear and distinguished friend, Johanna Cucuradi, many thanks for your excellent contribution from many years to the culture of peace and non-violence, to mediation, to know that what really matters is in the concept of culture, our everyday behavior. This is what really you have made a fantastic personal and institutional contribution. Many thanks, therefore, in a moment in which now, for the first time, now we are in a condition, we the peoples, as it is said in the Charter of the United Nations, for the first time, we recognize ourselves in equal dignity. We recognize ourselves able to express what we are thinking. We must not be any more spectators of what happens. We must be now actors, very active actors, in order to change the present trend. After 78 years, the fantastic Charter of the United Nations, we the people have resolved to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of the war, has not been applied. Why? Has not been applied because there is the powers of the veto of the G7, of all those that represent the very ancient reaction to peace. Si vis pacem para bellum. During many years in which there was an absolute male power, was this. Si vis pacem, prepare war, para bellum. And now we are in a position in which we can change this. We can say, si vis pacem, para verbum. Now we must prepare mediation, we must prepare negotiation, we must prepare the solution of the democracy. This is what it is said in the UNESCO's constitution. In the article number 1, it is said that education is to be free and responsible. Free and responsible. Now, we the people, we have resolved to be free and responsible. Now, for the first time in history, we recognize equal dignity. We are in a position in which we must say no more veto. It is intolerable that after 78 years, never the Constitution, the Charter of the United Nations has been applied. Dear Johanna, many thanks for what you have done, for what you are doing, and on behalf of all those that consider that now we must say that enough is enough. That now we must, yes, now we the peoples, we can take the floor. Now we the peoples, we must perhaps give some new light to the present very somber future.
Çok teşekkür ediyoruz Profesör Mayor'a. Şimdi ikinci konuşmacımız Yersu Kim. Kendisinin de özgeçmişini okuyacağım şimdi size gönderdiği şekliyle. Daha sonra da makalesini okuyacağım. Bu arada atladım onu. Profesör Mayor'un başlığı, konuşmasının başlığı, İnsan onurunda eşit, kendimizi özgürce ifade edebilecek biz halkların zamanı geldi. Evet. Yersu Kim is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Seoul National University, Seoul, Korea. Born in 1936 in Korea, Kim was educated in Korea, US, Harvard University, and Germany, Bonn. Well, he had his bachelor's degree at Harvard and then PhD in Germany, Bonn. He wrote extensively in Korean, English, and German on themes related to the philosophy of language, the philosophy of culture, global ethics, and aspects of Korean culture. He served as the director of UNESCO's Division of Philosophy and Ethics from 1995 to 2000 and was responsible for the landmark report, A Common Framework for the Ethics of the 21st Century. He is a past president of the Korean Philosophical Association and was vice president of the International Federation of Philosophical Associations. He served as the chair of the organizing committee of the 22nd World Congress of Philosophy. Yersu Kim led the Korean National Commission for UNESCO from 2000 to 2004. During his office, he helped establish the Global Academy for Future Civilization, serving as the chancellor until recently. Evet, başlığı, makalesinin sunumunun başlığı Profesör Kim'in Resilience of Truth, Hakikatin Direnci. As I stand here on this beautiful October morning of 2024 to congratulate the 50th anniversary of the Philosophical Society of Turkey, my thought goes back to the beautiful October days of 1989 when you were celebrating the 15th anniversary. You had invited the steering committee of the International Federation of Philosophical Societies to participate in the celebration. I see in my mind Evandro Agazi, then president of the FISP, Benan Goshi, the past president, Imamichi of Japan, Barkan Marcus of the United States, Odera Oruka of Kenya, Wahba of Egypt, Mishver Niaze of USSR, and many others who were members of the CD, as the steering committee was called. They were all philosophers of international renown. Professor Kuchuradi and I met first in 1983 in Bangkok at a UNESCO meeting on philosophy in Asia. We were both young, in our late 40s, and we became friends. I still remember Joanna in those days, with her silver hair on her elegant silhouette, not much different from today, as she emerged to become a leader in the world philosophy, queen of world philosophy, as our Russian colleague Mishver Niarage used to say. She then invited me to Ankara in 1989 to work with the philosophers in Turkey and from all over the world. Professor Kuchuradi and I became natural philosophical allies, particularly in the conviction that philosophy in the hitherto neglected parts of the world must join the global philosophical conversation in a common effort to deal with the problems facing humanity. Istanbul hosted the 21st World Congress of Philosophy in 2003. This was the first time World Congress was held outside the sphere of Western civilization in its 100-year history. Korea had the honor of hosting the 22nd World Congress, China succeeded us, and with an interlude in Rome, Japan will be the host of the next World Congress. It is incumbent upon the young generation of philosophers from all over the world, particularly of Turkey, with such a rich tradition and legacy, to move forward the eastward progression of the world philosophy. Although we represented different cultures and even hostile civilizations, I think we were largely one in the perception that problems facing humanity, such as environmental degradation, human rights, poverty, had now reached a crisis point. We were unanimous in the conviction that the crisis was a crisis of ideas, beliefs, and values that had been at the basis of modern society. We were agreed that it is incumbent upon philosophers to deal with the world problems. Such a task setting for philosophy was based on the shared conviction that objective truth was possible in knowledge of both facts and values. Despite manifold assaults on truth and objectivity from post-positivistic positivism, Wittgenstein, Kuhn, Quine, and postmodern deconstructionism, Derrida, Foucault, Barthes, folk belief in truth and objectivity in knowledge, in truth and objectivity in philosophy, science, and everyday life has a resilient life of its own. Postmodern rejection of truth and objectivity tended to remain largely in theoretical and academic universe. After all, had not objective truth, based on a linear progress of science and technology, triumphed over the tribalistic Deutsche Wissenschaft of Nazi Germany and the ideology-laden Soviet science in the Cold War? Had not humanity at its disposal, among other gifts of science, a universal information system in World Wide Web that would lead to enhancement of creativity and problem-solving ability? Would it not enable people across boundaries of languages and locality to become to a common understanding? Assault on truth and objectivity. Today, I must confess that I cannot be so sanguine over the prospects of objective truth and possibility of intercultural dialogue on global common values that would be adequate to deal with the problems facing humanity and give substance to a post-Western civilization. Relativism, driven to its logical conclusion, abolishes the distinction between truth and falsity, right and wrong, knowledge and mere opinion, objectivity and subjectivity, and it seems to have reached its apex. Relativism seems to have permeated human societies everywhere, but particularly in the United States, the hegemon society of the Western civilization. It permeates not only people's thinking and action concerning social and moral issues, but all areas of knowledge, including hardcore scientific knowledge. There seems to be a widespread acceptance of the notion that all knowledge, values, and truth, which form the basis of man's praxis and relative to cultural background or system. Perception, truth, even reason itself are viewed as being relative. What we perceive, what we think reasonable, what we think are true is no longer explicated in relation to objective reality. Truth and reason become dependent upon the canons of rationality, valid only for a particular culture and period. Relativism is as old as the history of human thinking, and there have been many forms of it. But many of older relativism were largely based on an implicit acceptance of dichotomy between fact and value, grudgingly allowing relativism in the realm of values, but retaining universalism in the realm of facts. Thus, they tended to remain a halfway relativism. Its most recent and radical manifestation, conceptual relativism, refuses to accept this dichotomy by denying a determinate relationship between objective reality and the knowledge, or its linguistic expression. There exists a multiplicity of conceptual schemes, systems, or frameworks which consist of our belief about how things hang together in the world, normative rules regulating our social behavior as social beings, and standards of judgment concerning what is beautiful and what is sacred. Without these schemes, we would not be able to interpret the world. Without them, we would not have the world as we know it. These schemes are incommensurable with one another, and indeed, language expressing one scheme is untranslatable into another. There is no scheme-independent point of view from which diverse schemes can be compared and evaluated. Questions concerning all evaluative notions, such as truth and objectivity, reduce simply to which of these schemes we have chosen. There is, in short, no one universally valid scheme to which all other schemes can be reduced or translated. This radical and nihilistic epistemology, which had been confined largely to the circle of philosophers and cultural critics, had now entered the mainstream of social and political life around the world with astounding speed. This has been particularly true of the United States, with the entrance of Trump at the epicenter of politics. Fake news and alternative facts are sent around the world through social media at lightning speed. There is a rampant disregard for facts and reasoned discourse, and people are locked in tribalistic sectarian self-imposed isolation. Trump, during his first term as the President of the United States, a nation which prided itself as the inheritor of the European Enlightenment, had been counted as having made false or misleading statements on 2,140 occasions during the first year in office, assailing the press, the justice system, the electoral system, and civil servants. The most powerful individual on earth is, in fact, continues to engage in an all-out assault on truth and objectivity, even today, without real impunity. Following the example of the most powerful figure in political life, many lesser figures are joining the seemingly sudden surge of attacks on truth, fact, and evidence and justification. So much so that concerned media carries leading articles such as, "Is Truth Dead?" Serious publications with such titles as "The Death of Truth" is on the bestseller list of newspapers which had been considered paragons of serious journalism and defenders of truth and fact. In many countries of Europe, the original pole of the Enlightenment civilization built on reason, truth, and science, waves of popularism and tribalism are on the rise. In the UK's Brexit vote, false claims of that country's financial relationship with EU is set to vote in favor of leaving the Union, which had been the achievement of many years of reason and cooperative discourse. Sweden has voted to strengthen the right-wing part built on nationalism and anti-immigration platform. At the time of this writing, the far-right Freedom Party of Austria has won close to 30% of the vote in national election. It is said to be the first time since the end of World War II that a right-wing party has claimed the most vote in a national election in Austria. Effects of cyber war in spreading disinformation to undermine truth and democratic institutions are set play considerable roles. Nor is my region, East Asia, exempt from the authoritarian and nationalistic turn. Contrary to the postulate formulated by Seymour Lipset in the 1950s, that economic development and openness lead to greater political liberalization, many observers note that China is turning toward nationalism and authoritarianism. Its leaders argue that socialism with Chinese characteristics would continue to make the country competitive. Last year, the CCP enshrined the present leader and his thoughts in China's constitution, paving the way for him to stay in power indefinitely by amending to remove the term limits. China's astounding transformation encourages some observers to see in the so-called China model, China Dream, as offering an alternative path to economic and political development. As China's rise comes at the time of self-doubt and soul-searching with liberal democracies and viability of the liberal international order is in question, the idea of China as an alternative path to political development gains greater traction. Indeed, some leaders in Asia, Africa, Europe, and even in the US justify their turn toward greater authoritarianism just on this ground. In my own country, Korea politics are so divided along ideological lines that national agenda to move the national forward and to make the lives of people better stands competitively stalled. Paradox of relativism. Popper is only one among many philosophers who expressed a deep concern over relativism by branding it the greatest of modern irrationalism. Rorty says that possibility of knowledge that may be objectively true is the impulse which drives the youth to read their way through libraries. Relativism, when embraced by dominated cultures or those with aspirations to dominion, encourages particularistic tendencies in knowledge and tends to encourage an illusionary sense of adequacy. The result is a philosophical endorsement to the abandonment of arduous intellectual task of integrating all forms of knowledge into the core of objective knowledge that transcends the boundaries of cultures constituting the common intellectual property of humankind. There is even more sinister political aspects to the contemporary surge of relativism. The Western culture, since its early days, but particularly the rise of science and technology, has laid strong claim to possessing a body of universally valid knowledge and values that are essential ingredients for a human society to be civilized. Since there has always been an intimate connection between truth and knowledge on the one hand and power on the other, by Francis Bacon, universal claims of truth and knowledge went hand in hand with cultural universalism and imperialism. One is tempted to say that it is no accident that proliferation of relativism today coincided with the demise of colonialism and the rise of the other world. But if relativism is true, and there are no standards that can adjudicate among different claims, the relationship of a human being to another, nation to nation, culture to culture, becomes one of the immediate will and power. As we witness today, a frightening weakening and disintegration of the key institutions of the liberal world order, WTO, for example, and naked power struggle among mature powers and ascendant powers, trade wars between US and EU, between US and China, between US and Turkey, for example, one can see clearly that a cultural relativist can become a worse kind of cultural imperialist. Thus, we are left with a curious twist in the dialectic of ideas. An idea that has its origin as an antidote to the disempowerment and as a means to rehabilitate and revitalize discredited cultural traditions and restore respect and tolerance among cultures seems now to have turned against itself. Resilience of truth. There have been many philosophical arguments against relativism. The oldest is based on its self-refuting character. A consistent cultural relativist cannot claim that all cultures are just as good as his own without ceasing at that moment to be a relativist. For, in all truth and value with which one adjudicates their validity are relative to the norms of a particular group, there can no intelligible sense in which one culture can be better than another. Quine puts the argument in this way. Truth, says the cultural relativist, is culture-bound. But if it were, then he, with his own culture, ought to see his own culture-bound truth as absolute. He cannot proclaim cultural relativism without rising above it. He cannot rise above it without giving it up. Nihilism, the thesis that there is no such thing as being just as good, is the only valid conclusion that can be drawn from objective truth and value. Davidson puts forth a similar but more sophisticated argument based on considerations of translations and conceptual scheme. The crux of Davidsonian argument is the charge that no sense can be made of different conceptual schemes on which all forms of relativism depend one way or another. When one speaks of a conceptual scheme, it can be identified with a particular linguistic system which expresses it. If two linguistic systems are mutually translatable into each other, then one must assume they embody the same conceptual scheme. The criterion of identity or difference is linked with whether one can be translated into the other. The order for the expression, different conceptual scheme, to be meaningful, there must exist a language that is untranslatable into our own language, or any of the languages which are translatable into our own. But there can be no such language. What, in fact, makes a certain cluster of sound and inscription a language? It is that it be translatable into our own language. If those sounds and inscriptions are not translatable into our own language, there would be no reason for us to suppose these sounds and inscriptions are uttered by a language user, a thinking being, and indeed a human being. If it is meaningless to speak of alternative conceptual scheme different from our own, then conceptual relativism cannot be maintained. When we accept relativism, we are compelled to deny the possibility of all human intellectual activity and consequently the possibility of culture in general. Once we accept these theses, not only is translation from one language into another impossible, but understanding and comparison of different epochs of the same cultural tradition also becomes impossible. If we cannot translate the sounds emitted by another being into our own language, that is, if we cannot understand him as matter of principle, there can be no reason to regard him as a human being. There would be no reason to regard him as a speaking being, and as a corollary, as a thinking being. Radical relativism, in Putnam's words, a mental suicide. Truth and objectivity as cultural synthesis. If relativism has been shown to be a philosophy that is both incoherent and nihilistic, it is far from the case that truth and objectivity of facts and values are securely anchored in our intellectual discourse. In fact, if relativism has shown anything at theoretical level, it is that folk realism of ordinary discourse, which imputes objective validity to truth about facts and values, is clearly as problematic as relativism itself. I shall not go into the lively realism debate on truth and meaning during the 1980s. An important lesson for my proposal to search for global common values is that we must seek a new ground for truth and objectivity that rises above the pitfalls of both relativism and realism. It is important to bear in mind that just as dealing with the problems which afflict humanity at this historical juncture requires us to step outside the parameters of the Western cultural synthesis, it is just as imperative to remember that there is no simple going back to the basis of Asian civilization. Both civilizations had at one time strong and largely persuasive claims to be universal. Just as the Western synthesis had given to outstanding solutions to the problems facing humanity, so may many of the key components of the Asian civilization able to play a key role in drafting and formulating the emerging synthesis of the future. The task then is to forge a cultural synthesis of values and ideas that would be adequate to the new historical realities and persuasive enough for humanity to embrace and make its own. In the process, we must not fall into another rigid universalism. Because we live in an age more skeptical about universal ideas and values and more receptive toward plurality and diversity, it is primarily in the way a given culture comes to grips with fundamental problem it faces, we must seek commonality that binds different peoples. Values and ideas of different cultures and civilizations intersect at points where commonality of the problems they face makes itself manifest. Would not such an approach free us from the metaphysical and epistemological baggage which makes the search for truth and objectivity such a difficult task? Culture, in its broad sense, is an internally coherent and cohesive set of values, beliefs, knowledge, and practices by means of which people relate themselves to the world. These ideas, values, and practices together constitute some notion of an ordered universe, human's place in it, and specifying for human beings a set of purposes in relation to himself, his fellow beings, and nature. As the world is in constant flux, so too must culture be in constant transformation. Culture is a kind of living organism with an internal dynamism of its own, always looking beyond the boundaries set by itself. As the world and our knowledge of it change, culture too must change so as to make itself adequate to the changing and changed circumstances. Culture is a milieu of conflict. Cultures of each epoch and locality strive to forge an optimal cultural synthesis and claim for its superiority over all others. The basis for their claim would be that it transcends the limitations of their competitors and avoids their weaknesses while incorporating their strength. The conflict need not be in a nature of immediate will and power, so long as the synthesis achieved is couched in cross-cultural, universal, but fallible constructions. I sometimes think of the case of the Hellenistic kingdom of Pergamon on the Aegean coast, whose ruler bequeathed his kingdom to, at a time of critical political and cultural achievement, Rome. The optimal synthesis would reflect a reflective equilibrium in the process of interaction and the change of ideas on the one hand, and the recalcitrant but changing environmental on the other. The language of such an equilibrium would be fallibilistic, but its ambition would be universal. Such a synthesis would then become a model for emulation for other cultures and sometimes the yardstick against which the worth of another culture's efforts at synthesis may be measured and evaluated. Although ambition of the cultural synthesis may be universalistic, its language and spirit must be fallibilistic. This must be so because our knowledge of the world, truth of the world, proceeds from a distinctly human and limited perspective and is acquired by contingent, unprivileged, and biased means. Relativism is, in a sense, a reminder that human is finite. Our conception of reality, the truth about the world, is never fully accurate or unbiased picture of the world as it is. Even if we could be certain that the world as it is, the world an sich, existed, it would be beyond human capacity to know. Even if it were known by us, as when we might have a glimpse of highest mountain shrouded in permanent cloud, we would not be able to tell we had. Okay, there is nothing continuing with this sentence, so I'm passing to the next one. They need to go together with some ontological platform which sees the physical universe as existing independently of our knowledge of it. I believe these epistemological and ontological positions are eminently defensible, although such a defense would be outside the scope of this talk. My purpose is to regard the possibility of truth of an optimal cultural synthesis as a regulative idea in the Kantian sense. It leads the efforts of different peoples and periods to forge a synthesis of ideas, values, and practices perfectly adequate to the requirements of humans and the constraints of the environment. The task would be somewhat akin to that of an archaeologist who, on the basis of meager material, attempts an overall picture of an ancient, little-known civilization. As the picture offered may undergo revision, sometimes minor, sometimes radical, whenever some new material is discovered and thus moves closer to the true picture of that civilization, so too our knowledge of the world and our conception of how best to flourish in it undergo a continual process of disruption, correction, expansion, and enrichment. As our knowledge of the world increases and our horizons expand in the wake of greater contact with other peoples and cultures and greater knowledge of scientific facts, our notion the optimal cultural synthesis is bound to undergo a similar evolutionary process of revision and expansion. But the finitude of the human being constrains us from expecting that this evolution process would be linear and continuous. The trajectory would be more in the form of an irregular spiral. This is what encourages all of us engaged in the search for truth and objectivity. 1st of October 2024, Seoul, Korea. Okay, by the way, ben okumuş muydum biyografisini? Aferin bana. Peki. We are moving, üçüncü konuşmacımıza geçiyoruz. Gabriel Vargas Lozano. Biraz sonra videosu yayınlanacak ama ben size kendisinin gönderdiği şekliyle tanıtacağım kendisini. He holds a PhD in philosophy. He is the ex-president of the Mexican Philosophical Association, member of the CD of the WISP from 2014, professor in the philosophy department, Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. Besides the 3 books that he has written, he has more than 70 essays published in various languages. Videoyu alabilir miyiz lütfen?
Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to congratulate Turkish Philosophical Society on its 50th anniversary and convey the congratulations of your Mexican colleagues from the Philosophical Association of Mexico. Our association was founded in 1968, but its activities were resumed years later due to the serious social problems we faced in our country during those years. Therefore, we can say that we share a similar history. I especially want to thank Professor Dr. Joanna Cucciurati for her invitation to participate in this celebration. Because of my health, I couldn't be in person, but I am sending the recording to my talk and written text for your to later. You read later. I recall with great affection that I had the fortune to participate in this extraordinary World Congress you organized in Istanbul, and later in the colloquium on philosophy in the city held in Bursa. On all four occasions, I enjoyed your hospitality and witnesses the fraternal ties that unite our two countries. Thank you very much. Congratulating the Philosophical Society of Turkey on its 50th anniversary. I'm also really grateful for the honorable invitation to participate in this conference. In particular, I want to extend my greetings to Federico Mayor, Pierre Sané, William McBride, Lucas Garantino, and acknowledge their significant contribution to philosophy on global scale. In this presentation titled The World Today from a Latin American Philosophical Perspective, I will discuss some of the major social issues that, in my view, the Latin American region faces at the start of the 21st century. These challenges reflect both global trends and our unique historical and cultural formation. What characterizes our people and cultures is a profound multiculturalism and steadfast resistance to colonial domination that has persisted over 500 years. Due to limitations of time and space, I will focus on three of what I consider to be the most significant issues facing the region. In the first place, the persistent social inequality in Latin America. Second, the conquest, colonization, and the path of decolonization. Finally, the emergence in recent years of social movements seeking justice and an alternative for our country. All this taking place under the tragedy of the war in the Levant region and Ukraine, both of which threaten global stability and peace. In first place, the persistent social inequality in Latin America, exacerbated by 4 decades of neoliberal policy. Between 1803 and 1804, the German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt visited Mexico and left in his memoirs a testimony of the inhumane treatment of the indigenous people and the enormous inequality between wealth and poverty and the poverty. In his words, I quote, Mexico is country of the inequality. Nowhere does there exist such appalling contrast between poverty and wealth, civilization and ignorance, cultivation and barrenness, as in the Kingdom of New Spain. Out of the quote. This statement can be extended to all Latin America. Over the past 40 years, such persistent inequality has not only endured, but has worsened due to implementation of neoliberal policies. Pioneered by the economist Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, with the Mont Pelerin Society, and put into practice by leaders, as you know, like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in early 80s. While some countries have made efforts to halt the dismantling of the welfare state and the privatization of public goods, the overarching strategy remains globally dominant and will persist as long as a new alternative is not established. Neoliberalism was imposed on our countries with little resistance, partly due to the collapse of the regimes of so-called real socialism in Eastern Europe and USSR between 1989 and 1991. The socialist bloc, led by Soviet Union, had acted as a counterbalance to the power of the United States. However, this collapse led a geographical, political, ideological reconfiguration that favored unipolarity. With the United States government, agreement is dominant. Exclusively, this was tempered by the widely promoted text of the Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, and which Fukuyama argues that socialism had come to an end and the democracy had triumphed. Over time, it became evident that the fundamental problems of capitalism persisted, that the so-called real socialism was not authentic socialism due to its lack of democracy, and that the democracy being promoted was circumstantial. His dictatorial government generally continued to exist. It also became clear that democracy under its liberal form was constrained by what Italian philosopher Norberto Bobbio referred to as the powers behind the ballot box, restricting which democracy fundamentally to the politics sphere. For the left, the fall of the socialist bloc was one of the most devastating blows in the 20th century. Yet over the time, the Soviet socialism ceased to be identified with true socialism, as I say, which has been allied with democratic movements since the 18th century. And mass work was no longer seen as legitimizing bureaucracy. Today, there is a need to deepen a new alternative. The second, the conquest, colonization, and the path to decolonization. In our countries, the conquest and colonization largely meant the destruction of the rich and ancient cultures of the indigenous people. This phenomenon produced profound fractures that threatened the cultures of indigenous people and led to the subordination of the remains of that culture, Western, Iberian, and Christian culture. Efforts were also made to eradicate the languages and world views that have been resisted by the surviving peoples and cultures over the past 500 years. The destructive form adopted by Spanish colonization didn't imply a Hegelian Aufhebung, a cultural synthesis, but our Eurocentric negation of the colonized. However, in the middle of the 20th century, important studies reclaiming indigenous worldviews and ways of life began to emerge, and today constitute a fertile line of study of global and the global South, and increasingly in Anglo-Saxon academic circles. Despite its many forms, the decolonization movement has emerged as a profound critique of the negative consequences of the colonization and the Eurocentrism, as well as the revelation of the cultural riches of the indigenous people. In the third place, social resistance movement. Social resistance movements in Latin America have been responded a variety of challenges, from indigenous rights and gender equality to environmental protection and migrant struggles. Together, this movement reflects resistance of the region of the various forms of domination and oppression in the 21st century. Regarding the Zapatistas, one on January the 1st, coinciding with the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the Zapatistas Army National Liberation launched the uprising in Chiapas, Mexico. This rebellion is spearheaded by indigenous people, symbolized their resistance against neoliberal capitalism and the fight for their right to self-determination. The Zapatistas' unique blend for indigenous wisdom with the global leftists so has been a beacon of resistance in the face of relentless capitalist expansion. The second front of social resistance is the ongoing struggle for the gender equality and women's rights, particularly against the stretched patriarchal system. Significant progress has been made, with many countries in the region enacting laws to protect women from violence and discrimination, as well as advancing reproductive rights and political representation. However, the fight continues as the inequalities persist in various sectors of the society. The third significant front of resistance concerns the environmental crisis, particularly the unchecked exploitation of natural resources by multinational corporations and local elites. El movimiento de afectados por represas en Latinoamérica, movement of those affected by them in Latin America, for example, has organized against the construction of the hydroelectric dams that threaten to flood vast areas of arable range and indigenous territories. This movement and others are often described as embodying a form of environmentalism of the poor, where the defense of the environment is inseparable from the struggle for social justice and human rights. The fourth and equally critical resistance movement is driven by the plight of migrants fleeing the horrors of the dictatorial regimes, drugs, cartel violence, poverty, and war. The migratory crisis affecting Latin America and other parts of the world, including the Middle East, has created unprecedented humanitarian challenges. The current Latin American refugee crisis mirrors earlier waves of displacement, such as during the Spanish Civil War or post-World War II migration, but with an intensity fluid by neoliberal globalization, destruction of local economies, making it another profound tragedy of our time. These social movements highlight the intersection of various forms of domination, capitalist exploitation, patriarchal oppression, environmental destruction, and geopolitical violence. Together, they reveal the multifaceted nature of resistance in the 21st century, where struggles for autonomy, justice, and sustainability are deeply interconnected. The storm clouds of the horizon. The world faces two critical crises that threaten global peace. The first is the armed conflict between Russia and NATO over Ukraine, which has resulted in thousands of deaths and widespread destruction. This war reflects deep-rooted geopolitical tensions and has established not only the region, but also the global energy and food supplies, illustrating the fragility of the international order. The second crisis is ongoing genocide in Palestine, particularly the violent confrontation between Israel and Hamas. The humanitarian toll of the Palestinian population has drawn global condemnation, and resolved nature of this conflict continues to fuel instability across the Middle East. Both crises highlight the urgent need for a diplomatic solution, yet the current global system has struggled to address these deep-seated issues. In summary, Latin America today faces a complex mix of challenges deeply rooted and its history unshaped by global dynamics. The ongoing issue of social inequality worsened the decade of neoliberal policies continue to block fair development across the region. The lasting impacts of conquest and colonization highlight the need for genuine decolonization efforts that honor the rich, diverse heritage of indigenous people. At the same time, vibrant social movements advocate for justice, gender equality, environmental protection, and migrant rights are forging new paths toward a different future. Amid global crisis, threatening peace and stability, such as conflict in the Middle East and Ukraine, it is crucial for Latin America to continue pursuing social justice and contribute to fairer, a more peaceful world through solidarity and collective action. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bir saatlik bir aramız şimdi geldi ses galiba. Bir saatlik bir aramız olacak. Bir saat sonra görüşmek üzere yeniden. Efendim?
Katılım belgeniz ve küçük bir hediyemiz vardı.
Çok teşekkür ederim. Niye
Naşit
zahmetler
Saadet'in
ettiniz
proje
böyle?
kitabımızda.